All right, welcome back. We are GAME2015. That's VR development at George Brown, and we are basically in the winter of 2019, lesson 2, and we're doing an intro to Blender. Blender's not going to be the only thing we do this semester during this lab time. We're going to be actually using this lab time to develop our games and meet with your team and all that stuff. But there's going to be at least an hour of we do together, and there's going to be another hour of you do, or your team, you do something with your team. Today we're going to have an intro to Blender. There's going to be an interactive exercise that you're going to have to put up for your participation marks. There is a forum that I've created on Blackboard. You're going to create a thread on that forum, and you're going to take a snapshot of the stuff that I'm looking for you today, right? So every time we get together, this will be due by the end of the day today, we'll do some kind of interactive exercise to get you to practice with the tools we have. For people that are not here, they won't get their participation marks. It's simple as that. All right. Okay, so let's talk about a couple things. One, remember that your contract is due by Thursday. So if you already have it, I'll create a Dropbox that you can digitally upload it to up on Blackboard on Thursday. That's what's happening. But for now, yeah, is that a hand? Oh no, that's not. For now, what I want you to do is we're going to be using Blender for to create our 3D worlds. That's what we're going to be doing this semester. Again, do I expect you to be an artist after this? No. Do I expect you to be a Blender artist? I think the answer is hell no, right? But do I expect you to know something about 3D art and 3D modeling at the end of this? Absolutely. And you will be tested on some of it on the midterm. So please participate. All right, so we're going to go to blender.org where you're going to download the tool. Some people ask, why Blender and not Maya? Blender is free, right? This is a good thing. And there is a great workflow from Blender into Unity, right? So that's why I'd like you to get Blender. It's about 80-something megs. Please get this version here, 2.7b or 2.79b. Don't get the 2.80 beta. That would be a totally different version of Blender. Although it looks amazing, it's a totally different workflow than the one we're using today. All right, so please download Blender 2.79. I also highly recommend that you use your own laptop for this course. And for this part, you also need a 3-button mouse, all right? If you have a 3-button mouse and your own laptop, you have more control. You can use Windows systems as well as Mac or even Linux, if I'm not wrong. Which is really cool. And I think this is great as a cross-platform development tool. All right, so please download Blender. When you do so, you'll be downloading you'll open it up, Blender, it'll look something like this. Notice it'll say 2.79b up here. You'll also see a couple of things. I'm just going to describe these things in terms of what they are. So again, you've got your toolbar on the left, right? You've got your viewport in the middle, and you've got your inspector and your outliner on the right. Okay, so there's different panes here, right? And it goes from left to right. So the toolbar, we're going to do a couple things this semester with Blender, and one of them is you need to remember some of the shortcut keys that we're going to be using. I'm going to be testing you again on this on your midterm. And the way to learn the shortcut keys is to actually do them, right? So I want to take away this toolbar to give myself more real estate. You press the T key. Let's remember this. The T key takes this away, T. So you can toggle this on and off, right? All of the panes can be moved around and resized. They can also be dragged and ripped away. Don't do that right now, but they can be realigned so you can make your layout the way you want. This is the editor pane or the view pane. The top right corner also has another pane. Let's take a look at this. You can see here you have something called the outliner, right? The outliner gives you a view of all the objects in the scene. Notice that you have a camera in the scene, a cube in the scene, and a lamp in the scene. Those 3 things, okay? By default. Then you have the inspector. And the inspector is context sensitive. So whatever you click on in the scene, we'll talk about that in a second, whatever you select in the scene, you see what appears in the inspector. There's also several tabs. The inspector is not just a pane on the right, but also a bunch of different tabs that are part of the inspector tool on the right-hand side, okay? So again, toolbar, editor, outliner on the top, inspector on the right, and on the bottom, you have what looks like a timeline where you can do some animation. So animation happens in here, okay? So you have, if you notice, there's a bunch of different frames, and you can do frame-based 3D animation in here. And that's where that's done. On the top, you have different layouts on the top left. So there's a layout up here. Right now we're in default layout. There's also different scenes as a unit of container, right? And then there's different rendering modes. There are 3 different rendering modes in Blender. Rendering means how well they draw or render to the screen. One of them is Blender Render, which is the one we're using, right? It is a non-node-based shader system, all right? So it's not node-based shaders like you'd find in Unreal, all right, or a shader network. They don't have that. It's literally, it's very similar to what we do with Unity with materials. We have a material. The material has different properties, okay? There's also Blender Game. Blender Game allows you to make a little simulation, a little game in Blender with Python, actually, and something called logic bricks. So visual programming in Blender, right? It's been there since the beginning. And I've been doing Blender since about 2009, all right? Then there's Cycles Render. Cycles Render is photorealistic rendering with a shader network. And you can use things like Substance Designer to create your shaders and your stuff in there. And it's really kind of cool, but you can really incorporate this in a more photorealistic setting. If you want to make a realistic looking model or a realistic scene, cycles rendering is the way you go. We do not use cycles typically in a game environment unless you want to do some concept art or background or cinematic or something like that. But typically it's photorealistic, so it takes a lot of time to render. Okay, so those are the 3 rendering modes in Blender, or rendering engines, if you will. One thing to note about Blender is everything we do is through a right click. So if I select something on the scene, like this camera, as an example, here's my camera, I can right click on the camera to select it, right click on the object in the middle. This is a cube primitive, right click. You do not left click. And some people say, well, why right click? Everything else is left click in the entire Windows and Mac ecosystem. Well, not in Blender. In Blender, you right click for selection in object mode, which we'll talk about. Different ways of translating things. You have also noticed there's these little arms here, right? You have a little red arrow, a green arrow, and a blue arrow. Like you see in other programs, blue represents the Z-axis, and if I drag on the blue arrow up and down, I can translate an object in space only across the Z-axis. I can constrain the translation across the Z-axis, right? If I click on the green arrow, I translate across the Y-axis. And if I click on the red arrow, I translate across the X-axis. Okay, that's what I'm doing here, okay? Notice also from a button perspective, we have several buttons on the bottom here that allow us to do different transformations. The first one is for translation. There's also this one, which allows us to rotate across different axes. This one right here, it looks like an arc, right? And there's another one like this that looks like a kind of an arm with a cube at the end, and that allows us to scale an object. Now, the shortcut keys for these are the G key for movement. So if I press G, I can freely move an object anywhere in space. If I want to constrain it, immediately after I press the G key, I can press the axis of constraint. So I can say G and then the X-axis, and then I can constrain it across the X-axis. If I want to accept the translation, I can press Enter, or I can left click. So again, if I press G and then the axis of translation, let's say the Y-axis, I can translate the object or transform the object in 3-dimensional space, and then I can press left click or Enter to accept. If I don't, so if I press G and then the Y-axis, and then I press Escape, it'll pop back into where I was originally translating it from. So G allows me to move an object in three-dimensional space. I can drag the arrows as well to do the same thing. If I want to rotate an object, the hotkey for rotation is the R key. So if I press the R key, I can rotate an object across let's say the X-axis by immediately putting the X after that. So R and then X. X allows me to translate an object across the X-axis, right? And again, R and Y across the Y-axis, right? R and Z across the Z-axis, right? Or I can freely transform by just pressing the R button and transform across any axis, I guess, by my perspective. Okay? Sometimes when we move an object around like this, we want to reset the scene. Control N will allow us to reset the scene. Notice if I move away from that, over here it disappears. You have to stay in one place for this one. So Control N, and then reload the startup file. Or you can go here, File, New, which also does the same thing. Okay? If I want to delete my cube, I can press the X key to delete it. I can delete my cube. If I want to put it back, there's two ways to put it back. Three ways. One is I can reset the scene again and get the cube back to the default scene. Or on the menu here, there's a menu option down here with Add. And if I go Add Mesh, because that's what we're making, a polygon mesh, a polygonal mesh, and then I can go to Cube, and it'll add it back into the scene. That's one way. Or if I want to use the shortcut key, which I always use, it's Shift A. And Shift A will allow me to add my cube back into the scene. Okay, that's what it does. Now, undo Control Z. Okay, so again, let's go over some of these things. If I was going to start a new Blender file, the T for toggling, toggle the toolbar on and off, right? I can press G to rotate, to translate an object in three-dimensional space, right? I can press G and then the axis of constraint, X, let's say, to translate it across the X-axis only, right? R for rotation across, let's say, the X-axis by pressing R and then X. I can press S to scale across, let's say, the X-axis, so I can scale it larger across the X-axis. To look at the scene a little bit differently, to orbit around a point, I can press the middle mouse wheel, hold and drag around the middle mouse wheel to allow me to rotate across the object or the center of rotation, which is in this case the center of the screen. If I want to zoom in, I scroll in and scroll out with the mouse wheel. That's one way of doing it. Okay, and if I want to pan, I can hold the Shift key as well as pressing the middle mouse wheel, and I can kind of move the scene around anywhere I want. Okay, so that's the way we add stuff in. For those people coming in late, guys, you can't come in late for this one. Okay, if you come in late, you're going to miss stuff. I have an interactive exercise at the end of the class. You're going to have to hand in for your participation marks. They are worth marks at the end of the class. At the end of the semester, they're worth 10% of your final grade for you to do the exercises. You can't do that unless you're with me. And you're not with me if you're late. Okay?
Sorry.
No problem. At the end of the day, though, you do have an option to hand it in by tonight at midnight, your interactive exercise, but you need to know what we're doing. I am recording the class up on YouTube. Okay, questions around what we've done so far? Any questions? Does anyone have problems with Blender at all? How do I transform what? So press the G key. So again, let me just start over. So again, we'll start over a bunch of times. So again, here's my cube. And what do you want me to do? So if I want to press the G key to move, G moves it around, right? S scales from everywhere unless I specify otherwise. If I specify S and then Y, it'll scale across the Y axis, right? And if I do it again, S and then Z, I can scale across this axis to create another shape, right? All right. I've also talked about adding. I've also talked about adding stuff in. So when you add stuff in, take a look, right? You have something else in here, which is funny to see, but it's the three-dimensional cursor. So if I have a three-dimensional cursor, I can left-click to move it. And that's why they right-click to select. Left-click moves the three-dimensional cursor around the screen. The three-dimensional cursor is where the point of origin for all newly added objects. So if I want to add an object over here, I move the three-dimensional cursor there, and then Shift-A, which allows me to add, let's say, another cube. Over here, Shift-A, and then I can add another cube. Okay? And you can see that there's 3 cubes. There are 3 cubes in the scene. Again, I could always use the menu as well, but I highly recommend Shift-A. You learn the hotkeys. If you forget, you can always use the space bar. And if I want to add, and if I say add mesh, if I go mesh, I can also look at looking at meshes or whatever. But if I want to add a new shape, you can add icosphere, right? You can see that there's different things you can add here. And if you scroll down, there's a bunch of other things you can add if you forget how to do it, okay? The space bar allows you to search for stuff that we've done and to give you some hints on how to do certain things. Okay, challenge number 1. And I'm going to stop recording temporarily for this. I want you to use your tools that I've shown you already to build a wall 5 cubes wide and 3 cubes high. And it has to be super accurate. Okay, hint, hint. You can press the N key that brings up a numeric transform. So you can actually see the numbers exactly, and you can toggle that on and off, the numeric transform, just like I can toggle the toolbar on and off, okay? The numeric transform allows me to transform or translate these objects or scale them in any way. So again, 5 cubes wide and 3 cubes high. I'm gonna go around and make sure everyone's doing the right thing. And if you're doing something else, you shouldn't be in this class right now because we're practicing Blender. You're going to need it for your project, your VR project this semester. All right? So I'm going to stop recording, and then we'll continue after this.